Kia ora koutou, good afternoon. I'm Anne-Marie Case-Miller and welcome to our Smash Round the Kitchen Table online event. Firstly, a huge thank you to our Smash sponsors DairyNZ, FMG, Balance, Pioneer and Rabobank. We value their support and without it, our events, both online and on farm, wouldn't be possible. As we move towards the beginning of calving, it's a good time to talk about managing your transition cows correctly and setting them up for a productive season. The transition period includes the 3 weeks before and after calving, and during this time, cows undergo many physiological challenges. So today, Jane Kay, Senior Scientist with DairyNZ, and Dave Swney, a Waikato farmer, will discuss transitioning cows in detail. Jane's a research scientist at DairyNZ with more than 20 years' experience in the NZ dairy sector. Since gaining her PhD in dairy cow nutrition and physiology from the University of Arizona, her research has focused on milk composition, lactation management, nutrition, and the transition period. She's the science advisor to the Northland Agriculture Research Farm and currently has 3 master's students working on different projects. A little bit of trivia you may not know about Jane is that she actually started off doing a physical education degree in Otago as she wanted to work with elite athletes. And she says she does that now, it's just the 4-legged kind. Waikato farmer Dave Swney came out of Lincoln University with a degree in agricultural management and rural valuation. He worked for DairyNZ as a consulting officer all over the North Island for 5 years before ending up back on his parents' 450 cow dairy farm where he's been for 8 years. Dave's currently contract milking and equity on this farm, but he also oversees 3 other dairy operations in the greater Waikato area. Dave sits on the Smash Trust and is a member of the committee as well. And in what spare time he does have, he enjoys a spot of fishing, mountain biking, and a couple of quiet beers. Jane and Dave are happy to answer any questions you may have. Just write them in the comments section on Facebook or sign in to YouTube to do so. That's all for me. I'll hand over to Dave now.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks for those introductions. As Anne-Marie said, guys, there's, we want to try and keep this quite interactive today. We've got about 30 to 40 minutes to run through what we've got to talk about. So it's such a big topic. There's so much to cover, but we'll try and fit it in that short amount of time. So, but if you've got questions and comments as we go, as Anne-Marie said, just jot them down in the comment section. They'll come through to our screen, and I'll try and collate them as we go and try and cover off some of those questions for you. So yeah, I guess Jane's been looking forward to catching up with you and talking about this transition period as well. It is so important, and we're just finishing off the season today, as it is, and we're looking forward to next season and trying to set things up as best we can to make the most out of next season. So are you able to maybe just outline why this transition period is so important, and some of the things to sort of consider?
Yes, thanks, Dave, and and thanks, Smash, for having me along today. As Dave said, it is an area that is really important, an area that I'm really passionate about. So really value the opportunity to be able to to sit here and talk and answer questions as we go through. So as Anne-Marie pointed out, it's how we describe the transition period as 3 weeks before calving to 3 weeks after calving. And it seems like such a short period of the year, but it's an incredibly important period. So if an animal transitioning through, how successful they are really impacts on her milk production for the rest of that season. It impacts on her health, and then that impacts on her reproductive success. So they've done some work looking at, when a cow leaves a herd, or reasons that a cow leaves a herd, and a lot of that can be due to how successfully she transitions through that period. So, really important. I suppose what is really important is it's not just those 6 weeks. That's the time that's described as the transition period, but what we do beforehand has a big impact on, on how successful that cow will transition through that period.
Yep. No, thanks for that. I guess, like it can be so complicated and so stressful. Is there a way we can sort of try and simplify this, or a bit of a checklist that as farmers we can kind of go through and make sure we tick all the right boxes?
Yeah, it is. It can be really complicated, and you'll hear a lot of, maybe conflicting messages or just different, I suppose, interpretations of what you should do during that period. So I've got a bit of a slide here that I think helps. It sort of sometimes helps, like they say, how do you eat an elephant? You do it in bite-sized chunks. So sometimes if we can just simplify down what we need to do through this period, look at some of the principles that can help us get a plan in place. And I think that's one of the most important things during this period, is having that plan in place on your farm and having everyone in your team, on board with that plan, to know what to do, to know what, when things are not looking good. So, what does it mean when you've got a problem, things like that. So I've got a checklist here that if I'm working with a farmer, that's what I like to go do. And I think the most important thing as you're sort of coming into this calving period is trying to identify any of those at-risk cows. And I think, Dave, as we go through the next 30 minutes or so, we'll probably touch on these in a bit more detail as we go. So, the first one is identify those at-risk cows. The next one is try and, make sure all your cows are at that correct body condition score. And this is something that you need to start doing, back in January or February. At that time, look at those animals that are not on target to hit their body condition score at calving. Look at what you're going to feed them pre-calving, so through the dry period, and particularly, as those springers in those 3 weeks before calving. And then, look at the minerals that are required. And so I think we'll touch on these a bit more as we go through, but probably the 4 key minerals that we need to understand and look at through that transition period are your magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, and potassium. And the last one I've put down there, and it often depends on what type of system you're running, but understand what DCAD is, how it works in your system, and if you're wanting to look at implementing it, what are some of the challenges, risks, and how can you go about doing it?
Yeah. I guess a lot of us as farmers do associate a successful transition period or not a successful transition period generally with the number of down cows, hard calvings, and that sort of thing that we get. From your point of view, Jane, what does good look like? And I guess at what point should we as farmers seek a bit of help or look a bit further?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, and you'll know yourself, and others will know that sometimes the season can have a big impact on on what happens. We'd say 2%. When you start to see more than 2% of your animals as downer cows or having problems, that's what we would say is you probably need to go and seek some help. Look at what's happening. Look at what you could do differently. I've been out before at groups and sort of said, who here has downer cows? Does anyone have a problem? And people say, oh no, we don't have a problem at all. And as you sort of delve into it, you realise that they bag every cow at calving, or so it's really if you are having to intervene or treat, more than sort of 2% of your herd, then I would say that there's something that we could look at doing differently before that transition period to try and stop that. I think the biggest thing is that prevention is easier than cure. So, there are principles or practices that we can put in place to try and reduce the risk of problems through that transition period, and that's much more favourable than trying to treat animals once you have got, calving difficulties or downer cows or, problems with milk fever, ketosis, that sort of thing.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So I guess if we're in the middle of calving and we are sort of going over that threshold and things are turning pear-shaped, what would be sort of, I guess, the first thing that a farmer should do or go to seek a bit of advice?
Yeah, and I think the first thing is to, consult your vet. So I'm not a vet, and all my research has been in nutrition and the transition cow and prevention rather than, I suppose, treatment. But it's trying to stop and have a look at what's happening, I think, and that can be really hard when you're in the throes of calving and dealing with, downer animals. And, it's often hard to step back and sort of think, hang on a minute, we've got a problem, what can we do? So first thing is the appropriate treatment for those animals. And there's lots of different, I suppose, there's starter drenches, there's different, treatment options out there. So talk to your vet about that. And then step back, I think, and have a look at, what is causing the problem. Have your animals had difficult calvings? Often, has there been a predisposed, to this? Have animals suffered from facial eczema early on in the season? Are your animals too thin or too fat? What are you feeding them? What minerals are in the system? So I suppose it's even, as you're going through this transition period, if you're having difficulties, take a look at that checklist again. What, where is your farm at? Can we find something, in there that we can rectify, for the rest of calving? So, if calving's spread over a few months, as it is, often we can put something in place that can then, help things as you move through that calving.
Yeah, okay. And I guess if we go back to that point on that checklist, the at-risk cows, what can we do for these cows? Like if we've got cows that have had facial eczema, I know it's been a big problem in the Waikato this year, or if we've got cows that are below condition score target as well because of those health problems or something else, what are some of the options that we can look to, and how should we be looking after those cows going into calving?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think identifying which ones are at risk is probably is the biggest thing to start with. So as you said, any animal that has suffered something like facial eczema or is thinner going into calving. So I suppose if we think about our body condition score targets at calving, what we're aiming for is for all cows, so mature age cows, to be a 5 at calving, our younger animals to be 5.5. And I think sometimes we forget a little bit about our 3-year-olds. So, often we focus on our heifers and they're new into the herd and we make sure that they're at a 5.5 at calving, which is the target. But often we forget about our second calvers, our 3-year-olds. And looking at some of the work, they are the ones that actually can have the poorest reproductive performance and can actually struggle the most in a herd. So making sure mature cows are 5 at calving, making sure our first and second calvers are a 5.5. So anyone that's not at those targets is an at-risk cow. Any sort of animals that have had previous problems with things like milk fever, they're ones to keep an eye on as well. Particularly Jerseys can be prone to milk fever. Older animals that are over a 6, are more prone to milk fever and problems. And yeah, I think it depends on where they sit. So animals that have that are thinner or lighter or have had some previous problem like facial eczema, we need to really look after them, feed them well before calving. Potentially, if we know that they're going to have a problem, something like a starter drench can be really handy to put into them as soon as they have calved. But really, I suppose, treat them with kid gloves. So look after them, make sure that as soon as they calve, we're getting calcium into them, that they've got a good supply of high energy feed available straight after they calve, and just be aware that they could run into problems. On the other hand, if you have animals that are over conditioned, and that's the other ones to be, I suppose, that are at risk, we look at treating them slightly differently. So if we have animals that are, 5.5 or above at calving, what we, one of the recommendations is that we can restrict their intake for 2 to 3 weeks before calving. Now, I want to, I suppose, define what I'm saying here. So often people will talk about, they'll say, oh, you're on about that starve to calve diet, and we can't starve our cows right before calving, and it's not that at all. I think it's making sure that people have got the right message. So when we're talking about it, we're saying cows that are 5.5 or above are animals that are at risk of metabolic disorders. So that's your ketosis, fatty liver, milk fever. And what we know is that if we can restrict their energy intake by a little bit, and I'm only talking about sort of, 1 kilo of dry matter or 10 megajoules of ME less, what we know is what it does is it primes up the liver. And so when an animal is, she's pregnant and she's still storing fat, she's sort of in what we call that anabolic state. What we can do if we just start to restrict her intake a little bit before calving is we switch on all of the genes, all of the pathways in her liver to start to mobilize a little bit of body tissue. So the liver's like the powerhouse of the cow, and that's where she makes all her glucose that she needs to make milk. It's where all the fat is metabolized to give her energy. So if we can start to switch on some of those pathways before she calves, then when she actually calves, and she has 2 to 3 kilos of tissue going through that liver a day to be converted into energy, she's much more able to cope with that challenge. I suppose I use the analogy a little bit that if you, if I was to go out and run a marathon next week, and the only training I had done is to go to the beer fridge and back, none of my muscles, none of my pathways or processes will be upregulated and able to cope with it. So if I was to go out and do some small runs and do more training, I'd be much better able to cope with that, that marathon run, because everything's been primed up and the pathways have been, started. So it's a concept that people struggle with, I think. I think it's, it's important to remember it's energy. So you may just look at replacing, high energy feed with a lower energy feed, such as, some straw or hay or something like that. In pasture systems, people say, I can't restrict the animals because, they paste the fence and damage the pasture. And that's where something like, straw or hay or a low energy feed can be used. But it has been something that I've seen work really, really well on a lot of farms, farms where they've had animals that are over-conditioned, they've been having trouble with milk fever, and it's been a really, I suppose, cost-effective, simple tool or strategy to put into place that's had some really positive, effects down the line.
Yeah. And I guess that it's an important point, is it's about the energy rather than the actual dry matter intake. You could still, achieve a 10, let's say a 10 kilogram of dry matter intake, but have a really low energy portion to that dry matter if you're using feeds like maize or straw or something else. So yeah, I think that's quite a good point to make about that whole topic there. I guess if we go back to some of those at-risk cows as well, are there some things that we could do once those cows have calved that are going to help sort of look after them?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, that colostrum cow, as soon as she calves, she's so vulnerable, and it's really important to, to look after her. When we think about a cow as she transitions from, pregnancy into lactation, her requirement for calcium goes up by 400%. So you've got this animal that requires very, very little calcium, and then all of a sudden she calves, she starts secreting colostrum, and there's 2 grams of calcium in every litre of colostrum that she secretes. So one thing is getting calcium into her as soon after she calves as possible. How you do that will vary depending on your system. It may be that, animals that have calved and moved into a break where lime flour, has been dusted, so they've, able to, consume it that way. It may be that, and I think you mentioned that's what you do, Dave, that, it might be a molasses and calcium, mixed in with the palm kernel trailers. So, the big thing is, after that animal is calved, separating her out from that dry mob or that springer mob, and making sure that she's got unlimited access to feed. I mean, an animal's intake after calving doesn't peak until about 10 weeks. So we want to make sure that, what she has got to eat is high in energy, it's good quality pastoral feed. We want to get as much calcium into her as we can as soon after she, has calved. They're probably 2 of the most important aspects there.
Yeah. And I guess if I relate it to our own farm system here, we run a policy of once a day on the colostrum cows, and we've done that for about 4 years now. It was quite a big leap of faith to get into that. There was a whole lot of questions going on in the back of my mind around mastitis and how the cows will cope, being bagged up straight after calving, just being milked once a day. But it's something that we wouldn't look back now and change, because it's just worked so well for us. I guess the comment about trying to get calcium and as much feed into those colostrum cows as you can, in our system here, we keep our colostrum cows moving every day, so we don't put up any fences. They go to a new paddock, get the whole paddock every day, so they can just eat as much as they can. And to get around the calcium side of things, I mean, most of us do have palm kernel trolleys or some sort of trolley lying around on the farm. We use just a palm kernel trolley with PK and a bit of high cal molasses just poured into there. Quite often, if I'm having issues as well, I'll go and add a lot more lime. But that's just our way to try and get those colostrum cows really building their appetite and trying to eat more and more energy and get more calcium into them. I guess for us as well, we also, to manage that period, because that worked so well for a couple of years, I decided, hey, I'll actually once a day, every single cow that calves for 10 days. And again, that's worked well. We are a high input system and high production system, and it goes against the grain a little bit in some people's opinions, but it's actually worked really well for us, and we don't think we've lost a lot of production because of it. And I guess on that note, Jane, are you able to maybe talk a bit about the science around the length of once a day and its impact on that cow's production for the season?
Yeah, and that, sorry, Dave, that should be a key one that you look at when you are trying to look after these animals after calving, or even at risk animals, sort of thinner animals, or, as we said before, anyone that's sort of been suffering something like facial eczema. I think once a day in the colostrum period is becoming more and more popular because people are seeing the benefits of it. So really what we're looking at is from from an animal perspective, we're limiting the animal's output in milk. So during the colostrum period, we'd see about 20% less production while she's being milked once a day, yet intake doesn't change drastically at all. So what we're seeing is an animal is able to partition that extra energy, to herself, to look after herself. And as far as calcium goes, we're reducing the calcium demand on that animal by 20% during that period. So most of the work that we've done with once a day has sort of shown that if you milk once a day for more than sort of 3 weeks in early lactation, you can see, production can be reduced over the whole season by a little bit. The longer you stay on once a day, obviously, the more production is reduced, throughout that season. But I think in saying that, in those research studies that we did, that was comparing healthy animals with healthy animals, and it was comparing, animals on twice a day with peak production versus going once a day. So that to me is probably the biggest that you'd see solely due to that change in milking frequency, that once a day milking. I think what we see on farm a lot more is that that once a day can help in a lot of reasons. As I said before, if you've got animals that are prone to milk fever, it can reduce the amount of calcium that they have to produce. It also, Dave, you might be able to comment on this, but it also, I think it gives everybody on the team more time, and more time means more attention to detail. And, that can often have benefits that are nothing to do with the once a day per se, but it's to do with, more time on the farm to, to look after, to bring cows in, to look after sick cows, to see what's going on. So, anything less than about 3 weeks of once a day milking at the start of lactation will have minimal impact on your whole season production, which I'm sure you've probably noticed now, over the seasons with your herds. I think actually the latest data show that there's less than 20% of herds in New Zealand now that are twice a day for a whole season. So it's just showing the use of once a day, now a little bit of this, 3 and 2 milking as well, but, in that colostrum period, and then, potentially later on in the season.
Yeah. Lisa's asked a question I'll get to just in a minute about colostrums and sort of hay versus silage with lime flour. But I guess just again touching on the once a day for us here, you raised a good point. I mean, the time factor has been massive for us as well. It's given us more time to go and take that PK trolley to the colostrums with the extra feed in it. It's given us more time to pick up calves twice a day. There was some worry that we weren't going to get enough colostrum and stuff like that, how we would manage colostrum, if we're not taking it twice a day, how are we going to heat up the milk and that sort of things for calves. But we've worked around that, and there's things out there on the market now like milk warmers and stuff like that that's really changed the way we farm and the way we feed our calves. So we worked through all of that and haven't really found any negatives from using that once a day period for sort of 10 days to 2 weeks. So it has worked really well. I guess just to cover off Lisa's question here, Jane, there's a question, what's better for colostrums, hay or silage? And I'm assuming that's grass silage, Lisa, fed with lime flour.
Yeah, I would, for the colostrum cows, I would be, that's your options, I'd be going with the silage just because of the energy. What you're trying to do in those colostrum cows is get energy into them. So, if you're feeding something like that with lime flour, I'd be going with your silage, and that's, good. Make sure it's good quality. That's like that with any feed, particularly silages. Make sure they don't have any mold in them, or they're not, poor quality feed. So, good quality silage, fed with your lime flour is fine.
Yep. Okay. And keep the questions coming, guys. And I know the once a day discussion should always there's always a lot of questions around that for people, and I know for myself, like I said, it was a big decision to make, but it's paid off really well for us. I guess going into the minerals side of things, Jane, they can be tricky as well, and I know there's not one recipe or one size fits all for every farm. So have you got some comments around minerals and that for that transition period?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I've got a couple of slides here if I just move through them. I can keep going through. Cover most of it. So yeah, I suppose the way I like to break it down is sort of, you look at magnesium, calcium, sort of phosphorus and potassium. So, magnesium is a really important mineral in the prevention of milk fever, also grass staggers, but it's required for the release of hormones and vitamins that are involved in enabling that calcium, making sure it's available for the animal. A daily supply is required, and I think that's something, that's really important about magnesium. You can't just load a cow up and think, oh, that's okay, I'll skip a couple of days. So she can't store magnesium, so she has to get it from her diet every day. And you want to be supplementing, we say 1 month before, some people will say 3 weeks, but you want to be supplementing before calving, and then, out to sort of about 4 months post-calving. Often people will wait till sort of after mating or whatever, and they'll look at taking the magnesium out. But, we want the Springer cows for calving to have about 0.4% of dry matter from magnesium, which for an animal depend on their diet here. So, the same again, there's not a one rule for everybody. It'll depend what else you're feeding as to how much, magnesium supplement you need to give your animal. A few sort of, I suppose, just little tips out there is be really aware of what source your magnesium is coming in. Are you using Coors Mag, or have you got, say, mag chloride or mag sulfate, mixed with feed or going in the water trough? So, what you're feeding, how much magnesium or elemental magnesium is in that product will then, dictate how much of that product you need to feed your animals. So, work it out. It's not hard to work it out. Information, is available. And what we tend to recommend is a mixture. So, if you're trying to put mag through the water trough, it tends to be, mag chloride or mag sulfate. But in order to get enough into the animals, you run the risk of palatability. So, they just won't drink the water. Also, be really aware that when, we've got a lot of rain, they don't drink a lot of water from the trough. They're getting water from, from the pastures and just from puddles and things like that. So, just having your magnesium source in the trough is not something we'd recommend. So we'd recommend a combination. So dusting your paddocks with mag oxide, but same again, be aware of the weather. So we can get periods where it just, we have one shower, but it sort of starts in June and doesn't finish till August. So, when it's just constantly raining and that, they're not getting as much, from the dusting. So just look at how much you put on, or mixing it with your feeds is the other option. So I think playing with some, different ways of getting that mag into them, having a combination so you're not reliant completely on one source is really important. Yeah. We've also found that with people that are having problems with milk fever, putting mag in the form of mag sulfate or mag chloride is more likely to prevent milk fever compared with just mag oxide. And there's sort of a few reasons there. But yeah, to me, magnesium is really, really important. The next one that I would talk about is calcium. And that is because an animal has to maintain your blood calcium at a really, a small range. And to do that, she absorbs the calcium from her diet. She can also reabsorb it from bone, and kidney if necessary. What happens is, for the cow, when her blood calcium gets low, she has to increase the proportion of the dietary calcium that she's going to absorb. And what we see at calving is, as I said before, the calcium demand at calving increases by 400%. So it's just this huge increase. And what happens is it can take time for all of the transporters within the rumen to upregulate in order to absorb more, in order to absorb more calcium there. So I suppose that what we recommend out there is we try and keep calcium intake as low as possible in the cow before calving. So if you think about it, if we have a Springer cow that requires 15 grams of calcium, and we're feeding her 100 grams, so that's 1% of the diet as calcium, she'll only be absorbing 15% of that dietary calcium. So she's shutting down all of the transporters in the rumen, that take up that calcium. So what happens then when she calves and she's got this huge demand for calcium, it takes time to switch on all those transporters and absorb more calcium from the diet. If we were only giving her 20 grams, leading up to calving, and she needs 15 grams, she's absorbing 75% of that calcium, that's coming in from the diet. So all of her transporters in the rumen are all switched on, they're all absorbing as much as they can. So when she calves, we put more calcium in through the line flow, or however it is, her intake increases, she's able to absorb a lot more calcium, at a lot quicker. So that's what we try, that's the theory, that's the principle behind trying to keep calcium as low as we can before calving, and then get as much as we can in as soon as that cow calves.
Yeah, and I guess that relates to your point around those colostrum cows and just looking at that energy and ways that we can be a bit sneaky about getting a little bit more calcium into them, sort of any way possible.
Yeah. And I think it's looking at, at your system of what works for you. I don't think there's any, like you said before, there's not an exact recipe to follow. There's some principles out there that, we've talked about. Try and get your cows, know your at-risk cows, get your cows to the right body condition score at calving. Look at what you're feeding them before calving, and then, how can you, use minerals in your system to, to achieve what you want to do. So, calcium, as we've just said, post-calving, it's really important to try and get it into them. So some people will say, how long do I need to leave the calcium, supplementation in? Once again, it depends, it sort of depends on what's happening on your farm. So in most instances, we don't see any real benefit of leaving it in there unless you're getting some issues with milk fever, in your milking herd. If you're getting issues with milk fever in your milking herd, by all means, keep the calcium in there. If you're not, then we don't seeing any advantage of leaving that calcium in, through that period.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. So there's just probably two more questions that I thought, if you want to maybe cover off the phosphorus quickly, and then two other questions I thought we would just cover before we run out of time was just sort of lush grass versus long rank grass. I think a lot of farmers, we tend to know which paddocks are good for calving on and let them, get a bit longer. Is this sort of the right thing to do, wrong thing to do? And then also at the end, maybe just a comment on what resources and that are available as well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, sorry, Dave. I know I talk too much. As I said, it's an area that I think you could any one of these principles within it, we could spend half an hour or 40 minutes on. So I just wanted to quickly touch on phosphorus because we're seeing, we see quite a bit of palm kernel fed through the dry period, particularly now. I think with FEI, people are not using it so much in milking cows, but then we know we can use it in the dry cows. But just being aware that it is quite high in phosphorus. And, when it comes to, milk fever and the transition cow, we want to try and keep phosphorus within a range. So we don't want it to be really, really low, which can be an issue with fodder beet. So, we're dealing with that with, people that are feeding fodder beet, but we also don't want it to be high. So we want to avoid feeds such as palm kernel to our, to our Springer cows. So that's just probably another, I suppose, tool in the toolbox out there if you're thinking, I'm having some issues, what could I potentially look at that could be causing them? So, in answer to the question about the, feed, like I suppose short or lush grass versus long rank grass, we know with, as grass matures, the mineral profile changes a little bit in it. So what we tend to see in longer, in longer grass is that we might get slightly more calcium and magnesium in it and slightly less protein or nitrogen and potassium. So there's some pros and cons of that. I think, and Dave, you'd be better to answer this than me. It's things like allocation of feed. So with your springers, if you're trying to say, I want to maybe, make sure that they're getting the right amount of feed, it can be really hard to do that when, you've got, pasture that's falling over and it's, it's quite long and lanky. Also, I think, if you're trying to restrict them, the longer the cover is, obviously, the smaller the area. So that can have some issues as well. So, Dave, do you want to just sort of comment on, maybe what you've done in that instance? Because, I think it's sort of quite a practical way of dealing with it.
Yeah, I think, like I've got some paddocks on the farm that I try and stick to for calving. They deal with calving really well, nice high and dry paddocks. So if they have got too long, I tend to just send my milkers through there on big areas. And that sort of, I guess, ticks the box around trying to increase the energy intake of those milkers just after calving. But it also takes, I guess, that sort of the top of the wedge off or that top sort of couple of hundred cover off that paddock as well, which actually allows me to keep the springers on a bigger area than what they would have been on if I had left it at, say, 4,000. So that's what sort of worked quite well for us, and that sort of things.
Yeah, and I think probably just the one thing about that, and we do that, on the DairyNZ farms as well, as sort of put the springers in behind the, the milkers, and that is just make sure you're getting your minerals into them. And I think, that can be and it's not that you can't do it, it's just thinking about how you do it. So
And one option with that people can do and sort of the more all grass systems is just give them a little break first and put the minerals on it, leave them there for a couple of hours before the fence gets wound up for the rest of the break.
Yeah, no, it's great. So, and I suppose on your question about resources is, plug for DairyNZ, I suppose, but on the DairyNZ site, there's a program that we've worked on, Feed Right, and it's a training program, but it's also got a lot of resources out there. So what it also has, which we've had some really good feedback from farmers and RPs using it, is a sort of a tool. It's an Excel tool called Feed Checker, and what that does is it allows you to put in your cows, so, you know, they're dry cows or they're in the transition period, their size, also what you're feeding, and it will work out what energy requirements are for those animals. And it also will give you, it's a bit like, I suppose, a traffic light system. It'll give you some, you know, red lights if your magnesium is a bit low, or if your, you know, energy is a bit low, you know, and it even has like a DCAD calculator on it if you're interested in doing that. So really encourage people to, you know, to jump on the DairyNZ website, look at Feed Right. There's some tech notes there, all on the, you know, transition period, and they're designed to sort of, you know, help you work through that checklist, so to speak, you know, but understanding behind it, but some sort of practical advice at what you can do on farm. And then the feed checker is you know, we've found it's a really good resource for you to put your cows in your farm, what you're feeding, and, you know, have a look at a bit of that sort of traffic light. Have I got a green light or have I got a red light? You know, in some certain areas, what can I do to, you know, to try and rectify that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jane. And, you know, I think just to wrap things up, and before I hand it over to Anne-Marie, I think a couple of points that I've sort of taken out of today is, you know, try and identify those at-risk cows before we head into that calving period, and maybe make a plan of how we can look after them to make sure we prevent some of those issues. As you said, Jane, it's all about preventative strategies if we can, before we're, you know, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So, and then, you know, post-calving, it's just about those cows, you know, increasing that energy, getting calcium to them, and if we are running into problems, just seek a bit of advice, you know, vets, advisors, and, you know, there's heaps of resources and information out there available to people. So thanks very much for your time, and it's always hard to fit it all in to such a small time gap, but I'll hand it over to Anne-Marie.
Oh, I think you guys did brilliantly, and thank you so much for just a really informative chat, Dave and Jane, and we really appreciate your time and your sharing of your knowledge and your learnings and your on-farm experiences too. So thanks again. Thank you also once again to our Smash sponsors, DairyNZ, FMG, Balance, Pioneer and Rabobank. Now, make sure you follow our Facebook page for upcoming events. And of course, you can register at our website, smallerherds.co.nz, for those events. Our next field day is at Rob and Sharon Klaus's farm at Matamata on the first week of June, June the 8th. We're going to find out how the Klauses successfully rear 500 calves in the spring, and then another 300 in the autumn. We're going to view their facility, hear about their system, and how they troubleshoot any issues. We're also going to hear from experts, including Emma Cuttance, Ursula Haywood, and Jane Kay is going to be at the field day, where she'll speak on this broad topic of transitioning cows. It's going to be a fantastic day full of learnings, so make sure you register on our website. Make sure you get lunch. I'm Anne-Marie Case-Miller. See you next time. Ka kite anō.